History is usually told as a story of centers, powerful empires, fertile river valleys, monument builders and lawgivers. We inherit timelines shaped around capitals, dynasties, and borders. But between those centers, often literally between them, there existed another kind of society, one that rarely makes it into the foreground of historical memory. These were intermediary cultures. They did not dominate large territories. They did not always leave behind grand architecture or unified written canons. Their power did not come from armies or surplus grain. Instead, they existed to connect. They lived in corridors, deserts, mountain passes, river mouths, narrow seas, steppe edges. Their survival depended on movement, translation, brokerage, logistics, and trust. In systems terms, intermediary cultures functioned as interfaces. They were not endpoints in civilizational networks, but conduits, nodes that enabled flows of goods, information, technologies, pathogens, beliefs, and people. Without them, large civilizations could exist. But with them, civilizations could interact, specialize, and scale. From a scientific perspective, this makes intermediary cultures structurally distinct. Archaeologically, they often show mixed material signatures, hybrid pottery styles, foreign weights and measures, multilingual inscriptions, imported raw materials processed locally. Genetically, they tend to exhibit high diversity relative to their population size. Linguistically, they are often polyglot, with pidgins, trade languages, or flexible semantic systems optimized for negotiation rather than abstraction. Crucially, their stability did not depend on internal production alone. It depended on throughput. As long as caravans passed, ships docked, or messengers crossed, these societies thrived. When connections weakened due to climate shifts, political consolidation, technological bypasses, or simple rerouting, their reason for being eroded rapidly. Unlike agrarian cores, they could not retreat into subsistence without fundamentally changing who they were. This makes their disappearance different from collapse in the classic sense. They were not necessarily conquered. They were not always destroyed by famine or revolt. Often, they were simply rendered unnecessary. A useful analogy comes from network science. Remove a hub, and the network fragments. Remove an intermediary node, and the network reroutes. The traffic does not mourn the road it no longer needs. Many intermediary cultures existed precisely because geography once made detours unavoidable. Narrow sea lanes, seasonal rivers, dangerous deserts, or mountain choke points forced interaction through specific human bottlenecks. Over time, innovations, new ship designs, alternate routes, political unifications, or even changing climate regimes flattened those constraints. What had been indispensable became optional. Optional became redundant. The irony is that intermediary cultures often accelerated the very processes that later erased them. By spreading technologies like improved navigation, standardized currencies, writing systems, and legal contracts, they reduced friction in long-distance exchange. Eventually, the larger systems they helped integrate learned how to bypass them. In the next segments, we will examine how these cultures formed, how we identify them archaeologically and scientifically, and why their disappearance often leaves behind unusually faint historical traces. We will look at real cases, from maritime brokers and desert traders to mountain pass societies, and treat them not as footnotes, but as critical infrastructure in humanity's long experiment with connectivity. Because before there were global empires, there were people whose entire civilization consisted of standing in the middle and keeping the world moving. Intermediary cultures did not emerge randomly. They formed in places where geography created friction, where movement was possible, but never easy. From a historical and scientific perspective, their existence was tightly constrained by physical landscapes that forced interaction through narrow channels rather than broad fronts. These societies arose in liminal zones, deserts that cannot be crossed in a single march, seas that required local knowledge to navigate safely, mountain ranges broken only by a handful of passes, river systems that linked inland production to coastal exchange. In each case, geography created a problem that neither side of a trade relationship could efficiently solve alone. Take deserts. Large agrarian states could produce surplus grain, metals, or textiles, but could not project regular transport across arid regions without catastrophic loss. Nomadic groups could survive there, but often lacked the industrial or agricultural output of settled cores. Intermediary cultures emerged at the interface: oasis managers, caravan organizers, camel breeding specialists, water route navigators. Their role was not merely to travel the desert, but to make it legible, predictable, and survivable for others. Maritime choke points functioned similarly. Narrow straits, seasonal monsoon routes, coral-filled passages, and tidal estuaries all imposed local constraints that rewarded accumulated environmental knowledge. Intermediary coastal societies often controlled pilotage, anchorage access, repair yards, and provisioning rather than long-distance fleets. They did not own the ships that connected empires, but they determined which ships arrived intact. Mountain corridors produced yet another variant. High-altitude passes compress movement into seasonal windows. Snowpack, avalanche risk, and altitude sickness impose biological limits that no amount of political power can override. Intermediary cultures here specialized in logistics rather than conquest. Pack animals adapted to thin air, layered clothing technologies, route maintenance, weather interpretation, and conflict mediation between lowland powers that could not directly occupy the terrain. What unifies these cases is that intermediary cultures existed where control was impossible, but guidance was essential. From a systems standpoint, geography created structural leverage. These societies could not block the world outright, but they could slow it, redirect it, or make expensive to bypass. Their power was subtle, embedded in local constraints rather than formal sovereignty. This often left them politically fragmented, yet economically indispensable. Archaeologically, this geographic dependency explains why intermediary cultures frequently leave uneven records. Permanent architecture is limited in deserts and high mountains. Organic materials decay quickly in humid ports. Seasonal occupation leaves thinner stratigraphic layers. Yet despite sparse remains, indirect evidence accumulates. Foreign goods clustered far from their source, standardized trade weights appearing in unexpected places, isotope signatures showing repeated long-distance movement through the same nodes. Climate science adds another layer. Many intermediary zones were highly sensitive to small environmental changes. Slight shifts in rainfall patterns could move viable caravan routes by tens of kilometers. Changes in prevailing winds could render ports obsolete within a generation. These cultures were therefore finely tuned to climatic stability and disproportionately vulnerable to disruption. Importantly, geography did not merely enable intermediary cultures. It limited their ability to transform into something else. Unlike river valley civilizations, they could not easily expand agricultural bases. Unlike empires, they cannot scale militarily without undermining the openness that made them useful. Their niche was narrow, specialized, and deeply contextual. This helps explain why intermediary cultures rarely evolve into dominant powers. Their success depended on remaining neutral, permeable, and adaptable. The moment they attempted to monopolize or harden borders, they risked becoming obstacles rather than facilitators and being forcibly removed or bypassed. In the next segment, we will look more closely at how these societies organized themselves internally, socially, economically, and politically to survive in such constrained and volatile environments, and why flexibility, rather than stability, was their defining trait. Intermediary cultures organized themselves around movement rather than storage. This set them apart fundamentally from agrarian civilizations whose stability depended on stockpiling grain, controlling land, and maintaining fixed populations. For intermediary societies, wealth did not sit still long enough to be counted in the same way. From an economic perspective, their primary asset was throughput, the volume and reliability of exchange passing through their territory. Goods arrived, were transformed minimally or redistributed, and moved on. Value accumulated not in warehouses, but in reputation, relationships, and timing. This shaped social structure in measurable ways. property ownership tended to be portable. Wealth was often expressed in livestock, transport animals, tools, navigational knowledge, or credit relationships rather than immovable land. In many cases, the most powerful individuals were not those who owned the most resources, but those who could mobilize them fastest. Anthropological evidence shows that intermediary cultures frequently emphasize kinship networks over centralized authority. Extended families, clans, and guild-like groups manage segments of routes, seasonal stops, or specialized skills. Leadership was situational, based on expertise in negotiation, environmental knowledge, or conflict resolution, rather than hereditary dominance alone. This produced societies with unusually high internal flexibility. Roles were fluid. Multilingualism was common and often expected. Legal norms were pragmatic rather than codified, focused on dispute resolution and contract enforcement across cultural boundaries. Social status could rise or fall rapidly based on performance rather than lineage. From a scientific standpoint, this is consistent with what we see in modern network theory. Systems optimized for flow prioritize low latency and high adaptability over redundancy. Intermediary cultures behaved less like fortified reservoirs and more like adaptive valves, opening and closing in response to demand, seasonality, and risk. Archaeological patterns reflect this. Storage facilities are smaller relative to trade volume. Settlement layouts emphasize access points, docks, gates, wells, caravanserai, rather than monumental centers. Artifacts show where from repeated handling rather than long-term display. Coins and weights often exhibit heavy circulation damage, indicating rapid turnover. Importantly, these societies were often deliberately undercentralized. Excessive accumulation would have made them targets. Fortification could signal hostility or exclusivity, inviting military intervention by larger powers. Instead, intermediary cultures often cultivated an image of neutrality and indispensability, embedding themselves into multiple political spheres simultaneously. This balancing act required constant negotiation. Intermediary societies acted as translators not only of language, but of norms, adjusting customs, prices, and protocols depending on who is passing through. This cognitive labor, though archaeologically invisible, was one of their most valuable contributions. However, a system built on flow is inherently fragile. When movement slows, there is little buffer. Unlike agrarian societies, intermediary cultures cannot fall back on stored surplus for long periods. A single failed season, disrupted route, or political closure could cascade rapidly through the system. This vulnerability did not always manifest as famine or violence. Often, it appeared as gradual thinning. Fewer travelers, fewer transactions, shrinking networks, younger generations leaving to integrate into core societies with more stable livelihoods. In the next segment, we will examine how intermediary cultures managed risk in such volatile conditions through redundancy of routes, social contracts, and adaptive technologies, and why these strategies were effective until they suddenly were not. For intermediary cultures, risk was not an occasional disruption. It was the operating environment. Every caravan, ship, or seasonal crossing carried uncertainty, weather, banditry, political shifts, disease, and market volatility. Survival depended not on eliminating risk, which was impossible, but on distributing and anticipating it. One of the most important strategies was route redundancy. Intermediary societies rarely relied on a single path. Instead, they maintained knowledge of multiple seasonal alternatives, inland versus coastal routes, summer passes versus winter detours, river crossings that shifted with flood cycles. Even when one route was dominant, others were kept viable through periodic use, maintenance, and oral transmission of knowledge. This redundancy was cognitive as much as physical. Navigational knowledge was distributed across individuals rather than centralized in maps or institutions. Elders, guides, pilots, and caravan leaders each held partial information. This made the system resilient to the loss of any single person, but also dependent on constant social transmission. Another key mechanism was risk pooling through social contracts. Intermediary cultures often developed sophisticated systems of shared liability. Losses from failed voyages, stolen goods, or environmental disasters were absorbed collectively through kin networks, rotating credit arrangements, or informal insurance practices. These systems reduced the incentive for individual actors to withdraw entirely after a single setback. Anthropological parallels can be seen in later merchant cultures using profit-sharing ventures, joint caravans, or ship partnerships. What distinguishes intermediary societies is that these arrangements were not peripheral economic tools, they were the backbone of social cohesion. Technological adaptation also played a role. Transport animals were selectively bred for endurance rather than speed. Ship designs favored repairability and modular components. Storage technologies prioritize portability and protection over volume. Even clothing and diet reflected risk management. Layered garments, high-calorie foods, and lightweight shelters optimized for mobility rather than comfort. Environmental science helps explain why these adaptations mattered. Intermediary zones often experience high variance rather than extreme averages. Deserts are not always deadly, but unpredictably so. Seas are not uniformly hostile, but periodically catastrophic. Systems optimized for average conditions fail in such environments. Intermediary cultures instead optimized for variance tolerance. Crucially, these societies also managed political risk. They avoided exclusive alliances whenever possible. By maintaining relationships with multiple powers, sometimes hostile to one another, they reduced the chance of being fully absorbed or eliminated. Tribute, taxation, and symbolic allegiance were often flexible, negotiated on a case-by-case basis. This political ambiguity, however, came at a cost. Intermediary cultures were rarely trusted completely by any side. They were tolerated because they were useful, not because they were secure. When larger powers developed the capacity to manage risk internally through standing navies, permanent roads, centralized logistics, or administrative control, the intermediaries' comparative advantage narrowed. At that point, redundancy began to work against them. Multiple routes meant diluted investment. Distributed knowledge meant slower adaptation to systemic shifts. Social contracts built for volatility struggled when volatility gave way to structural obsolescence rather than temporary disruption. In the next segment, we will examine how technological and political innovations, often incremental and seemingly benign, allowed larger civilizations to bypass intermediary cultures entirely, and why this process was usually invisible until it was complete. Intermediary cultures did not vanish because the world collapsed. They vanished because the world reorganized. From a historical and scientific perspective, the most dangerous developments for intermediary societies were not wars or famines, but efficiency gains elsewhere. Innovations that reduced friction in long-distance movement quietly undermined the need for human bottlenecks. Consider transportation technology. Improvements in ship design, deeper hulls, better rigging, more accurate navigation allowed vessels to bypass coastal pilots and risky stopovers. Caravans with improved pack animals and standardized provisioning could cross longer distances without resupply. Roads engineered for durability reduced dependence on local guides. None of these changes targeted intermediary cultures directly, but each reduced reliance on their expertise. Political centralization amplified this effect. As empires expanded administrative control, they internalized functions once handled by intermediaries. Taxation, security, legal arbitration, and logistics were absorbed into bureaucratic systems. Where a local broker once mediated disputes between foreign traders, imperial law imposed uniform rules. Where protection was negotiated through kinship ties, standing armies enforced order. From a network science perspective, this is a classic shift from decentralized routing to centralized infrastructure. Early networks rely on adaptive nodes to manage uncertainty. Mature networks invest in fixed pathways that minimize variability. Once established, these pathways favor scale over adaptability and marginalize those whose value lay in improvisation. Archaeological evidence of this transition is subtle but consistent. We see declining diversity in material culture, fewer hybrid artifacts, more standardized forms. Trade goods appear deeper inside imperial cores with fewer intermediary signatures. Settlement layers thin not abruptly, but through reduced rebuilding, abandoned workshops, and shrinking habitation zones. Importantly, intermediary cultures often participated in their own bypassing. They adopted new technologies, facilitated imperial expansion, trained navigators and administrators who later replaced them. Their comparative advantage eroded as their knowledge became codified and transferable. There is also a demographic component. Younger generations increasingly migrated towards stable centers offering predictable livelihoods. Skills once transmitted locally became portable credentials. Over time, intermediary societies lost critical mass, not through violence but through attrition. What makes this process difficult to detect in historical narratives is its lack of drama. There are no burning cities or conquest inscriptions. Instead, there is silence, fewer records, fewer names, fewer interactions. The culture dissolves into others, its distinctiveness fading as its function disappears. In some cases, intermediary cultures attempted to resist obsolescence by hardening control, charging tolls, monopolizing access, fortifying routes. This often accelerated their removal, prompting larger powers to invest in alternatives. What had once been a facilitator became an obstacle. By the time connections fully rerouted, the intermediary culture's disappearance was already complete in practical terms. Archaeologists encounter the aftermath as a gap rather than an endpoint. In the next segment, we will examine specific historical examples of intermediary cultures, maritime, desert, and mountain-based, to see how these dynamics played out in real human societies and why their material traces remain so elusive. To understand intermediary cultures clearly, it helps to examine what they look like at the moment they fade. Not in theory, but in practice, through archaeological traces, trade records, and demographic signals that point to disappearance without catastrophe. One recurring example is the Maritime Broker Society. These cultures occupied narrow coastlines, island chains, and estuaries where navigation required intimate local knowledge. Their expertise lay in tides, reefs, winds, seasonal currents, and safe anchorages. They rarely dominated long-distance trade themselves. Instead, they guided, provisioned, repaired, and mediated. Archaeologically, such societies are marked by mixed assemblages, foreign ceramics in domestic contexts, tools for ship repair, weights and measures calibrated to multiple systems. Written records, when they exist, often come from outsiders who mention ports, pilots, or tolls without naming the people themselves. When navigation improved and charts replaced lived experience, these societies did not collapse. Ports were not burned. Populations simply thinned. Settlements shrank inland or merged into larger coastal cities. The intermediary function dissolved, and the people became fishermen, laborers, or administrators within larger maritime systems. A second case appears in desert-edge trading societies. These cultures managed oases, seasonal wells, and caravan staging points. Their knowledge was ecological, water tables, grazing cycles, animal endurance limits. Their political role was often neutral, balancing relationships between distant agricultural states. Here, the archaeological record shows long continuity, followed by sudden sparsity. Wells fall out of use. Caravanserai are abandoned without signs of violence. Imported goods decline sharply, while local subsistence artifacts persist for a time, indicating a shift from exchange to survival. Crucially, these societies often did not starve. They adapted, but as something else. Pastoralism replaced brokerage. Some groups migrated, others fragmented into smaller kin units. The intermediary culture ceased to exist as a system, even if its people remained. Mountain pass societies show a similar pattern. These groups controlled altitude transitions, pack routes, and seasonal crossings. Their settlements were often temporary or semi-permanent, optimized for movement rather than permanence. Material remains are thin by design. When lowland powers built tunnels, switchback roads, or secured alternative passes, traffic rerouted. The mountain societies were not invaded, they were bypassed. Archaeologically, this looks like abandonment without destruction, structures left intact, tools left behind, as if paused rather than ended. Across all these cases, a common signal emerges: no terminal air, no burn horizon, no mass graves, no sudden cultural replacement. Instead, there's a slow reduction in interaction density. This challenges how we define collapse. Traditional collapse models rely on sharp discontinuities. Intermediary cultures demonstrate a different failure mode: functional extinction. The society stops doing the thing that made it a society. From a systems perspective, this is analogous to a protocol becoming obsolete. The data still exists. The hardware still functions, but nothing calls it anymore. In the next segment, we will examine why intermediary cultures leave such faint historical footprints and how this invisibility has shaped modern misunderstandings of past connectivity and resilience. One of the most striking features of intermediary cultures is not just that they disappeared, but that they are so difficult to see, even when we know where to look. Their absence from historical narratives is not accidental. It is a direct consequence of how they functioned, what they valued, and what kinds of evidence survive. Intermediary cultures were structurally low monument societies. They invested little in architecture meant to last centuries because permanence was not their advantage. Their capital was mobility, adaptability, and relationships. Stone temples, royal tombs, and centralized archives offered little return in environments where routes could shift, alliances could change, and settlements might be seasonal. From an archaeological standpoint, this creates a bias. Monument-building societies leave dense, legible layers. Intermediary cultures leave thin, discontinuous signatures, temporary structures, reused materials, organic goods, and portable tools. These degrade quickly or are archaeologically indistinct from background activity. Writing systems, when present, were often utilitarian rather than commemorative. Contracts, tallies, cargo lists, and itineraries were written on perishable materials, wood, leather, papyrus, or maintained orally. Once the network dissolved, there was little incentive to preserve these records. No court historians remained to copy them. No priesthood maintained continuity. Even when intermediary cultures appear in written sources, they do so indirectly. They are mentioned as functions rather than peoples: guides, pilots, middlemen, interpreters, caravan leaders. Their names rarely survive. Their voices are filtered through the perspectives of empires that viewed them as infrastructure rather than actors. Scientific analysis reinforces this invisibility. Stable isotope studies may show repeated long-distance movement, but not why. Genetic diversity suggests mixing, but not mediation. Artifact provenance reveals exchange, but not who coordinated it. Intermediary cultures sit in the negative space between datasets. There is also a temporal issue. Because these societies were tuned to flow, they often expanded and contracted rapidly in response to demand. Short-lived peaks of activity may leave only a single occupational layer before contraction. Traditional archaeological chronologies, which favor long-duration settlements, can easily miss or underemphasize these pulses. This has led to a systematic underestimation of connectivity in the past. When intermediary cultures vanish from the record, historians often interpret the result as isolation or regression. In reality, connectivity may have persisted through different pathways, or shifted faster than the material record can resolve. The silence is therefore misleading. It suggests absence where there was once intense interaction. It flattens dynamic networks into static maps. It turns facilitators into footnotes. Understanding this bias matters because it reshapes how we interpret resilience and collapse. Intermediary cultures reveal that connectivity itself can be ephemeral, and that societies built around it can disappear without leaving clear ruins or narratives. In the next segment, we will examine how modern scholars reconstruct these lost intermediaries using interdisciplinary methods, and why their recovery changes how we understand ancient globalization. Because intermediary cultures rarely announce themselves in the archaeological record, modern understanding of them depends on indirect reconstruction. No single discipline can recover them alone. Instead, they emerge at the intersection of archaeology, climatology, genetics, network science, and systems modeling, often as patterns rather than places. One of the most important tools is provenance analysis. By tracing the chemical and isotopic signatures of materials, obsidian, metals, ceramics, pigments, researchers can map movement without finding the movers. When materials from distant and ecologically incompatible regions repeatedly converge in the same narrow corridor, an intermediary system is implied, even if no settlement dominates the record. Similarly, distribution, asymmetries reveal mediation. Goods do not spread evenly outward from cores. They appear in clusters, pause, recombine, and then continue. These pauses often correspond to former intermediary zones. The absence of production debris alongside high volumes of finished goods suggests redistribution rather than manufacture. Genetic studies add another layer. Populations associated with intermediary regions often show disproportionate genetic diversity relative to their size. This is not random mixing, but structured exchange, repeated low-level gene flow from multiple directions over long periods. Importantly, these signatures can persist long after the cultural system that produced them has vanished. Linguistics provides further evidence. Trade languages, pidgins, and shared loanwords across otherwise unrelated language families point to sustained mediation. Even when a trade language disappears, its grammatical simplifications and borrowed terms may fossilize within descendant tongues, acting as linguistic shadows of lost intermediary cultures. Environmental reconstruction is equally critical. Paleoclimate data allows researchers to identify when and where corridors were viable. By aligning periods of climatic stability with peaks in long-distance exchange, scholars can infer when intermediary systems flourished and when environmental shifts may have destabilized them. Increasingly, scholars apply network modeling to ancient data. When trade nodes are removed from simulations, some networks fragment violently while others reroute smoothly. These models help distinguish between collapse-prone core dependencies and flexible intermediary-based systems. In many cases, removing intermediary nodes produces minimal immediate disruption, but long-term loss of diversity and resilience. This insight is key. Intermediary cultures were not always obvious stabilizers. They often absorbed variability quietly. When they disappeared, systems did not fail immediately, but became more brittle, more centralized, and more vulnerable to future shocks. Reconstructing these cultures therefore changes how we read the past. It reveals that ancient globalization was not a simple story of expanding empires, but a layered system of facilitators, translators, and adaptive brokers whose contributions were essential precisely because they were invisible. In the next segment, we will turn from reconstruction to interpretation, examining what intermediary cultures teach us about resilience, redundancy, and fragility in complex systems, both ancient and modern. Intermediary cultures force a rethinking of what resilience actually looks like in complex systems. Traditional historical models associate resilience with size, surplus, and centralized control. Yet intermediary societies often enhanced system-wide resilience precisely by not embodying those traits. From a systems perspective, intermediary cultures acted as shock absorbers. They smoothed fluctuations in supply, mediated conflict before it escalated, and rerouted exchange during localized disruptions. Because they were adaptive rather than rigid, they could respond quickly to changing conditions without requiring large-scale reorganization. However, this resilience was asymmetric. It benefited the larger system more than the intermediary itself. Empires gained stability and reach while intermediaries absorbed volatility. When conditions worsened beyond a threshold, The intermediaries failed first, often invisibly, while cores persisted for a time. This dynamic mirrors findings in modern network science. Systems with many flexible intermediaries can handle local failures gracefully. But when intermediaries are removed, through consolidation, optimization, or automation, the system may appear more efficient while becoming less robust to rare, systemic shocks. Historically, this explains why the loss of intermediary cultures often precedes, not follows, major collapses. Their disappearance does not immediately break the system. Instead, it removes adaptive capacity. Connectivity continues but becomes brittle, over-reliant on fixed infrastructure and centralized control. Intermediary cultures also illustrate a paradox of redundancy. Multiple routes, overlapping networks, and informal institutions look inefficient from an optimization standpoint. Yet they provide resilience through optionality. When efficiency becomes the dominant goal, redundancy is trimmed, and with it, the cultural systems that maintained it. There is a social lesson here as well. Intermediary cultures depended on trust, negotiation, and translation. They operated in gray zones rather than under uniform rules. As larger systems imposed standardization, these human skills were devalued, even as they remained critical during crises. This pattern is visible across history. Periods of high connectivity and apparent stability often coincide with the quiet erosion of intermediaries. When disruption finally arrives, climate stress, political fragmentation, or economic shock, the system struggles to adapt, lacking the flexible human infrastructure that once managed uncertainty. Intermediary cultures remind us that resilience is not just about strength or scale. It is about who absorbs uncertainty and at what cost. Systems that externalize volatility onto marginal actors may function smoothly until they cannot. In the final segment, we will bring this perspective forward, examining how intermediary roles persist today in altered forms and what their historical disappearance suggests about the future of global connectivity. Intermediary cultures did not vanish with the ancient world. They transformed. Their functions persist, even as their social forms change. And in many ways, the modern global system is repeating the same pattern, quietly eroding its intermediaries in the name of efficiency. Today's intermediaries are less visible as cultures and more visible as roles: logistics coordinators, local brokers, regional translators, informal repair networks, human arbitrators, and adaptive specialists who operate between rigid systems. They exist in supply chains, financial markets, information networks, and geopolitical interfaces. Like their ancient predecessors, their value lies not in production or control, but in connection. Modern technology increasingly seeks to eliminate these roles. Automation replaces local knowledge with centralized models. Standardization replaces negotiation. Platforms replace brokers. Routing algorithms bypass human judgment. Just as improved navigation allowed ships to bypass coastal pilots, digital infrastructure bypasses human intermediaries in favor of scale and speed. The result is familiar. Systems become faster and more efficient on average, but they also become more brittle. When disruptions fall outside modeled expectations, there are fewer adaptive buffers. The people who once improvised, translated, and rerouted have already been removed. From a historical perspective, this is not collapse, is functional erasure. The system continues to operate, often more profitably, while losing forms of resilience that are difficult to quantify and easy to dismiss. The disappearance goes unnoticed because nothing dramatic happens at first. Ancient intermediary cultures teach us that this phase can last a long time. Connectivity may even expand. Trade volumes rise. Networks look robust on maps. But when stress accumulates, climate volatility, political fragmentation, cascading failures, the absence of intermediaries becomes visible only in retrospect. There is a deeper lesson here about memory. Intermediary cultures rarely wrote their own histories. They were remembered, if at all, through the systems they enabled. When those systems outgrew them, they were forgotten, not because they failed, but because they succeeded too well. Understanding intermediary cultures reframes how we think about progress. It suggests that what looks like advancement from the center may feel like disappearance at the margins. That optimization can erase entire ways of life without ever acknowledging them. The forgotten intermediary cultures remind us that civilization does not move forward only by building bigger structures or faster routes. It also depends on those willing to stand in between, absorbing uncertainty, translating difference, and keeping the world connected long enough for others to believe the connections were inevitable. And when they are gone, the silence they leave behind is not empty, is structural.